Welcome to In-Silico Trials Real Impact, the In-Silico UK podcast that's revolutionizing the way we think about medical innovation. I'm Professor Alejandro Frangi from the University of Manchester, and I'll be your guide through this fascinating world of in-silico technologies. In each episode, we'll dive into cutting-edge research and groundbreaking news that are shaping the future of medical product development and regulation. From computational modeling to simulated clinical trials, we are exploring how digital approaches are transforming healthcare, making it safer, more efficient, more equitable, and incredibly precise. So, whether you're a researcher, regulator, a member of the public, or a patient representative, or simply curious about the future of medicine, tune in as we unravel the complex world of in-silico methods and their real-world impact. Get ready to discover how computer-simulated trials are leading to very real breakthroughs in patient care. In-Silico Trials Real Impact, where algorithms and data are saving lives. Let's begin.
We're hearing more and more these days about in-silico trials, right? Using computers to test new medical products.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal, actually, because it could mean we don't always need to do so many lab experiments or even like those really long human trials.
Right, like instead of giving a new drug to hundreds of people.
Exactly. We can create these really sophisticated computer models.
They can actually tell us
whether a new device or a treatment is safe and effective.
So it's like evidence.
Yeah, it's like evidence from the digital world.
Oh, that's interesting.
It really is a game changer. It could speed up the whole process of how we discover and get new treatments to patients.
So like how long it takes to develop a new drug could be cut in half?
Potentially even more.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it could make medicine a lot more personalized because we can tailor treatments to individuals.
But I think for our listeners, the big question is,
how can we be sure?
Yeah. How do we know that we can trust these results that are coming from a computer?
Right, like how do the regulators, the people who decide if a drug or a device is safe enough to use?
Like the FDA or the EMA.
Exactly. They need to figure out if a computer simulation is good enough to actually base decisions on, decisions that can affect people's health.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today.
Okay, sounds good.
We're going to be cracking the code of credibility.
Oh, I like that, cracking the code.
So what makes an in-silico method trustworthy?
Right.
And we're going to unpack some of the key ideas that really build this trust.
Okay.
And we're going to be looking at some things that you might have heard of, like verification and validation, and this interesting concept called uncertainty quantification.
Right now, this might sound a little bit like rocket science.
Yeah.
But we're going to bring it down to earth.
We are going to make it understandable and clear for everybody listening.
Yeah, it's really like trying to figure out if these digital doctors are giving us diagnoses that we can actually rely on.
Yeah, I like that.
And to help us kind of navigate through all of this, we're going to be using a really well-respected framework. Okay. It's called the ASME VV-40-2018 standard.
Okay.
You can think of this standard as like a super detailed guidebook for how to build and assess the trustworthiness of computer models, particularly for medical devices.
Okay.
And this whole thing is all about something called a risk-informed approach.
Okay.
Which means that the level of scrutiny that we apply, how carefully we check things, really depends on what's at stake.
Okay, so the higher the stakes, the more carefully we look.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so let's start with this idea of risk-informed.
Okay.
Because that seems like a pretty key concept.
It is a key concept.
So when we're trying to figure out if we can trust a computer model, it all begins with a very specific question.
Right. It's not just like generally modeling something.
Right.
It's about trying to answer a very particular question related to the safety or the effectiveness of what we're looking at.
Okay, so really targeted.
Yes, very focused.
Okay, so the whole process hinges on what?
The question of interest.
The question of interest.
This is the exact question that we're trying to answer with our computer model.
Got it.
And then we have something called the context of use.
Okay, context of use.
Or COU for short.
COU.
Okay. And think of this COU like the detailed instructions for how we're actually going to use the model's answer to help us make a decision.
So the COU is not just about the model itself.
No.
But about how its results fit into this bigger picture of all of the other evidence that you were talking about.
Exactly.
Like lab tests,
right?
Animal studies.
Human trials even.
Okay, so the COU really spells it out clearly.
It lays it all out.
Okay.
It tells us how the information from the simulation, from the computer model, will be weighed alongside everything else.
Right. All of those other pieces.
All the other pieces of the puzzle, and the more critical the decision is,
How hard are the stakes?
Yeah, the more we really need to be absolutely sure that the in-silico evidence is reliable within that very specific context.
That makes sense. Okay, so can you give us maybe a real-world example?
Sure.
Just to really nail this down.
Absolutely. So let's say the question of interest is, how long will a new type of artificial heart valve last?
Okay.
Under normal use.
Okay, that's a pretty important question.
It's a very important question.
Particularly if you need a heart valve.
Absolutely. So the context of use might be something like this.
Okay.
We're going to use a computer model to simulate the stresses on the valve, the mechanical stresses, over a period of 10 years of continuous operation.
Wow, so like simulating what happens to the valve over a decade.
Exactly, and then we're going to compare the wear and tear that we see in the simulation to thresholds for material failure that have already been established.
So we know how much wear and tear a valve can take before it's not safe anymore.
Exactly. And so in this case, the model's prediction isn't like the final word, but it gives us really crucial evidence that, combined with lab testing on the actual valve materials, can help us figure out how long that valve is expected to last.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
So it's a piece of the puzzle.
Right, and it's all spelled out in the context of use.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've got the question, we've got the context. And now let's talk about this idea of risk.
Okay.
Because you mentioned this is a risk-informed approach.
Right.
So what kind of risk are we actually talking about?
So one of the really insightful things about this standard is that it puts risk right at the front and center.
Right, like right up front.
Absolutely. So when we talk about model risk, what we mean is the chance that the model is going to lead us to the wrong conclusion. And that this error, this mistake, could have negative consequences.
Right. So it's not just about the model being wrong.
No, it's about what happens if we act on that wrong information. And especially when we're talking about medical products, those consequences can be really significant.
Yeah, because we're talking about people's health.
Exactly. We could be talking about patients getting harmed.
Right.
The need for more medical procedures.
Wow.
Even financial and reputational damage to companies.
So it's not just theoretical.
No, it's very real world.
Right. Okay. And so the standard really helps us unpack this idea of risk.
It breaks it down.
Yeah. And it breaks it down into two key parts.
Right.
So first we have model influence.
Yes, model influence.
So tell us a little bit about that.
So model influence is basically how much weight the model's predictions carry in the overall decision-making process.
Oh, okay. So how much are we relying on the model?
Exactly. So if the model is the main source of evidence for a really important safety claim, then its influence is high.
Okay, so it's high influence if we're really relying on it for important stuff.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's one part of the risk equation.
Right.
And the other part?
The other part is what we call decision consequence.
Okay, decision consequence. So is that like how bad things would be if the model was wrong?
You got it.
Okay.
It's the severity of the negative impact if we make a decision based on the model and it turns out the model was wrong.
Okay, so give us an example.
Sure. So if we have a model for a high-risk implantable device.
Right, like a pacemaker or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A mistake in that model has much more serious potential consequences than a mistake in a model, say, for a simple bandage.
Right, because if the bandage model's a bit off,
it's probably not going to
no big deal.
Be a huge deal.
But if the pacemaker's wrong,
that's a much bigger problem.
Yeah. Okay. So it's all about how much we rely on the model.
And what could go wrong.
And how bad it would be if it was wrong.
Exactly.
Okay. And this is where the credibility goals come in.
This is where it all ties together.
Right.
So once we understand the model risk, we can start setting these credibility goals for the computer model.
Okay.
And these are like the specific benchmarks we need to hit.
Like the targets.
Yes, the targets.
We have to reach.
Right. And we reach these targets through verification, validation, and showing that the model is actually relevant to the problem we're trying to solve.
Okay. And this is where the ASME standard really helps us out.
It gives us a roadmap.
Okay.
It actually gives us a checklist of what are called credibility factors, things we need to evaluate to be confident that the model is trustworthy enough.
Given the risk.
Given the risk, exactly.
Okay, so we've got the question, we've got the context, we thought about the risks. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty of actually building credibility.
Okay.
And that's where we get to verification and validation.
V.
Or V and V.
Exactly.
And these sound very similar.
They do.
But they're actually tackling very different parts of this whole model building process.
Right.
So let's start with verification.
Okay.
What exactly are we verifying?
So think of verification as making sure that we built the model according to the blueprint.
Okay.
It's all about checking the accuracy of the computer code itself and the mathematical methods that we've used to create this model.
Okay, so it's not about whether the model is a good representation of the real world.
Not yet.
It's just, are we doing what we said we were going to do?
Yeah, are we solving the equations, right?
Is the computer program actually doing what the scientists and engineers intended it to do?
That's a great way to put it. So the standard actually distinguishes between two types of verification.
Okay.
We have code verification and calculation verification.
Calculation verification. Okay.
So code verification is like proofreading the software code itself.
Okay.
It's looking for any errors in the logic or the actual programming.
Right. So it's like, are there any typos in the code?
Yeah, typos, bugs, things like that. And one of the main ways we do this is by running the code on standard pest problems.
Okay.
Problems that have known exact solutions.
Okay.
So we can see if our code actually gets the right answer.
Right. So we know what the answer should be.
Exactly. And one of the really rigorous ways to do this is to look at something called the observed order of convergence.
The observed order of convergence.
It's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful.
But imagine this.
Yeah.
You're zooming in on a picture.
Okay.
If the picture gets clearer at the rate that you would expect as you zoom in, that gives you confidence that the underlying process of creating that image is working correctly.
Okay.
So similarly, if the model's solution improves at the predicted rate as we make our calculations more precise, that builds confidence in the code itself.
Okay, so it's like checking the resolution of the image.
Yeah, it's like, are we getting more detail as we should be?
As we zoom in, okay.
Exactly.
And so that's code verification.
Right.
And then we have calculation verification.
So calculation verification comes after we're reasonably sure that the code itself is sound.
Okay, so we've proofread it.
We've proofread it. It's good.
We've looked at the order of convergence.
Exactly.
It all looks good.
Now we're focusing on the specific model that we've built for our particular question of interest.
Right. So for this specific application.
Exactly. And here what we're trying to do is estimate the errors that come from the approximations we make when we actually solve the mathematical equations.
Okay, because computers can't always solve things perfectly.
Exactly. They have to break things down into smaller chunks.
Right.
So, for example, if we're modeling a medical device, we might break down the shape of that device into a grid for the computer to analyze.
So it's like pixels on a screen.
Yeah, it's like pixels. Okay. And the size of those pixels, the grid spacing, can introduce some error.
Okay.
Similarly, if we're simulating something that changes over time, the size of the time steps that we use in the simulation can also introduce some error.
Okay, so we're checking how much error is introduced by those approximations.
Right, and the goal is to make these numerical errors small enough that they don't mess up our results before we even start comparing to the real world.
Okay, so we're trying to minimize those errors as much as possible.
Exactly. And one important difference between code verification and calculation verification is that with code verification, we're using problems that have known answers.
Right. Like the image getting clearer.
Exactly. But with calculation verification, we're usually dealing with our specific complex model where we don't actually know the exact answer.
Right, because it's a real-world problem.
Yeah, so it's more about making sure those errors are under control.
Okay, so that's verification.
Right.
Making sure our digital tools are working correctly.
From a mathematical and computational standpoint.
Okay, so now let's move on to validation.
Right.
So validation is where we really see if our model
reflects reality.
If it matches what happens in the real world.
Exactly.
So how do we do that?
So the key to validation is something called the validation comparator.
The validation comparator.
And this is the real world data
okay.
that we use to judge the model's accuracy.
So it's what we compare the model against.
Exactly. And this is really crucial. You can't have validation without real world data to compare against.
Right. You can't just say, oh, the model looks good.
No, it has to be checked against something real.
Okay. So we run our computer simulation and then we compare its predictions.
To measurements that we've taken from lab experiments or observations in the real world.
Okay, so it's like checking the model's homework.
Yeah. Is it getting the right answers?
Okay, and how do we actually do the comparison?
So we use specific metrics to measure how much the simulation results differ from the real world data.
Okay.
And really importantly, we also try to understand the uncertainty in this comparison.
Right, so how much error there might be.
Exactly, because nothing's perfect.
Right.
there's always some uncertainty.
Yeah.
And the ASME VV-40 standard really emphasizes that we need to be comparing apples to apples.
Okay, apples to apples.
So the inputs that we feed into the model
Right.
should match the conditions under which the real-world data was collected.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
And we need to be looking at the same types of outputs.
So we're not comparing like the size of an apple to the weight of an orange.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's validation in a nutshell.
Pretty much.
But you mentioned earlier that validation can sometimes lead to aha moments.
It can.
What did you mean by that?
So validation is where we're really putting our understanding to the test.
Okay.
Right. Because if our model's predictions consistently disagree with the real-world data.
Right, if it keeps getting things wrong.
Yeah, it tells us that some of the fundamental assumptions that we made when we built that mathematical model might be wrong.
Oh.
Or incomplete.
Right, or maybe we're missing something.
Exactly, and that's the aha moment. It's realizing where our understanding of the underlying science or biology might be flawed.
So it's not just about the model.
No, it can actually teach us about the real world.
It can help us improve our understanding of the science.
Absolutely.
Okay, I like that.
So verification is about solving the model, right?
Yeah.
But validation is about checking if we're solving the right model in the first place by comparing it to reality.
Okay, so that's the key difference.
That's a good way to put it.
Right, so we've got verification, we've got validation.
Right.
And you mentioned this other really important concept called uncertainty quantification.
Yeah.
So why is it so important to understand uncertainty?
So uncertainty quantification, or UQ as it's sometimes called,
UQ,
is absolutely critical, especially for models that inform high-stakes decisions.
Right, decisions that could really have a big impact.
Exactly, and it's really about identifying and analyzing all the potential sources of uncertainty in our entire process.
Okay, so not just in the model itself, but in the whole process.
Yeah, from the very beginning to the very end.
Okay.
So the assumptions that we make when we build the model.
Right, because we might not know everything.
Exactly,
Right.
the numerical approximations that we use to solve it.
Right, the grid size and the time steps and all of that.
Exactly. And even the inherent variability in the real-world data that we're comparing against.
Right, because the real world is messy.
It's very messy. There's always some variability.
Okay, so it's not enough for the model to just like kind of roughly agree with the data.
No.
We also need to know
How much wiggle room there is.
Yeah.
So how much variability or potential error is there in both the model's predictions and the real-world measurements?
I see.
Because you can imagine a situation where a model appears to match the experimental results really well.
Right.
But if there's a huge amount of uncertainty around both the model's output and the experimental data, that agreement might just be by chance.
Oh, okay.
You know, it could be luck.
Right, so it might not actually be a good model.
It might not actually be predictive.
Okay.
And so understanding these uncertainties helps us figure out
How much we can trust the model.
how much confidence we can have in its predictions.
Okay.
And it can also help us figure out how to make the model better.
Okay.
Maybe by refining our assumptions.
Yeah.
Or getting more precise data.
So uncertainty is not just about knowing what we don't know. It's also about improving the model.
It's about making it more trustworthy.
Okay, so we've covered verification.
Making sure our digital tool is precise.
And we've covered validation.
And making sure it's predicting reality.
And we've talked about understanding its limitations.
Right. Through uncertainty quantification.
Okay, so what's the last piece of the puzzle?
So the last piece is applicability.
Applicability.
And this is all about making sure that all of the verification and validation work that we've done is actually relevant to that specific context of use.
Right, that COU that we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like, is this all applicable to the real world problem that we're trying to solve?
Precisely. And essentially what we're asking is, do our validation experiments or analyses actually cover the range of conditions and scenarios that our model will encounter when it's used to evaluate that medical product?
So even if we've done all this work to check the model and we validated it in the lab, we need to make sure that what we did in the lab actually reflects how it's going to be used in the real world.
Exactly, because the lab is a controlled environment.
Right.
The real world is much messier.
Okay, so can you give us an example of this?
Sure. So imagine we're modeling how a new knee implant behaves.
Okay.
Our validation might involve testing it in a lab under very idealized loading conditions.
Okay, so like a perfect walking motion.
Yeah, very smooth and controlled.
Okay.
But in reality, patients have different weights,
Right.
different activity levels, and different ways of walking.
Yeah, everybody walks a little bit differently.
Exactly. So if our context of use doesn't capture this real-world clinical variability,
Okay.
our model might not be clinically applicable.
Even if it works great in the lab.
Even if it's perfectly verified and validated in the lab.
Wow.
Its predictions about how it will perform in actual patients might not be reliable.
So it's really important to make sure that the context of use
Reflects reality.
Yeah, reflects the real world.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the ASME VV-40 standard,
Right.
which is really focused on medical devices.
It is.
But are these ideas of verification, validation,
Right.
uncertainty,
Yeah.
also relevant for other types of models like those used to develop new drugs?
That's a great question, and the answer is absolutely yes.
Okay.
While the VV-40 standard is tailored for medical devices,
Yeah.
the fundamental need for trust and a systematic way to build that trust through VMV and UQ
Absolute.
extends to all areas of biomedical modeling.
Okay, so the principles are the same,
The principles are the same.
but the specifics might be a little bit different.
Exactly.
Okay, so can you give us an example of how these ideas might apply in drug development?
Sure. So in drug development, we're seeing increasing use of what are called physiologically based pharmacokinetic models.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
They're often called PBPK models, for short.
PBPK models. Okay.
And these models simulate how drugs are absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted by the body.
So like what the body does to the drug.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And regulatory agencies like the EMA have guidelines for these models.
Okay.
And while they're not identical to VV-40,
Right.
they emphasize a lot of the same things.
Like what?
So they really stress defining the context of use.
Okay, so what question are we trying to answer?
Exactly what's the purpose of this model.
Okay.
They also talk about the importance of verifying the model's equations and parameters.
Right, so making sure it's built, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Analyzing its sensitivity to different inputs.
So like if we change one thing in the model,
Right.
how much does the output change?
Exactly. And crucially, they talk about validating the model's predictions against clinical data.
Okay, so comparing it to what happens in real patients.
Exactly. And just like with medical devices, understanding the uncertainties in those predictions is vital.
Right, because we need to know how much we can trust the model.
Exactly. And this is becoming more and more important as we use these models to predict things like drug interactions.
Okay. Or even design more efficient clinical trials.
So it's really changing the way we develop new drugs.
It's a very exciting time.
Okay, so to bring it all together.
Yeah.
What are the key things that someone should remember about how we build trust in these in-silico trials?
So the most important thing to remember is that establishing credibility is a systematic, risk-based process.
Okay. So it's not just about building a cool model.
No, it's about following a process.
Yeah.
And that process starts with a very clear question.
Okay, the question of interest.
Exactly, and a well-defined context of use.
The COU.
COU.
Okay. And
then we have to think carefully about the potential risks.
Right.
What could go wrong if the model's predictions are off?
Yeah, what are the stakes?
Exactly. And this risk assessment then guides how rigorously we perform our verification.
Okay, so how carefully we check that the model is built correctly.
Right, and then our validation.
Making sure it reflects reality.
For our specific purpose.
Right.
Including understanding all of the uncertainties involved. Okay, so it's a whole package.
It's a whole process.
Yeah, and it's not just about getting regulatory approval.
No, it's much broader than that.
Right. It's about making sure that any model that's used in research,
particularly in biomedical research where it could impact people's health, is trustworthy.
Okay, so it's about doing good science.
Exactly.
All right. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive.
Enjoyed it.
Into this field that's becoming so important.
Yeah, it's really changing things.
It really is, and it's really highlighted all the thought and the rigor that goes into making sure these digital tools can be relied upon.
It's not just magic.
It's not just magic.
There's a lot of work behind it.
Yeah, a lot of science and a lot of careful checking.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for shedding light on this really important topic.
It's my pleasure.
And for you, the listener, think about how these ideas of checking your work, comparing it to reality, Understanding the potential for error.
Yeah.
And making sure it's all relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Apply not just to computer models in medicine,
but to other areas of your life.
but to any time you're making a decision
Anytime you're using information to make a decision.
based on some sort of prediction.
Yeah.
Think about these things.
Think about verification, validation, and uncertainty.
All right, until our next deep dive.
See you then.